Hello, anatomists. Michele Glass here, and we need to finish up our veins by studying those veins that drain the head and neck and feed back to the heart. And so taking a look here, we do have some veins with the same names that we saw in the arteries. On this model or diagram, we have our left side and our right side, and many of these are paired. So you will see them labeled as either left or right. We are looking primarily at the right view. And so all of these that we'll be labeling for the most part will be the right examples. Taking a look right up here, we see our temporal. So this will be our right temporal vein, which is going to feed into our external. So this is our right external jugular vein. Also feeding into the right external jugular vein, we will be labeling here our right maxillary vein. And remember, I'm saving myself a little bit of time by not writing the word vein every time, but that is definitely part of your study practice. So make sure you're paying attention to that. We also see kind of coming off of the external jugular vein, or maybe we should say like feeding into the external jugular vein, we have the right facial vein, which we see more easily feeding into the right internal jugular. Draining also the head, we have our right vertebral vein. And we see that the right vertebral vein, the right external jugular, the right internal jugular are all feeding into the right brachiocephalic vein, which we labeled on our previous video. So over here, just to be clear, this would be a cut piece of the left brachiocephalic vein. And that's, of course, feeding into our superior vena cava, which is, of course, feeding into the right side of the heart. Now, as we look into the skull itself and looking at the veins that are draining the brain, we're going to actually be calling a lot of these by the term sinus. And here the difference is that our sinus are these really big vessels that are lacking a muscular coat. So we see at the very top, we have a superior sagittal sinus, and these are servicing the brain itself. So they're looking faded out because we have a skull over top in this particular diagram. We have also an inferior sagittal sinus, which is feeding into the straight sinus. Also feeding into the straight sinus, we see right here, it's cut, the great cerebral. I'm running out of label room there, so let me adjust. Great cerebral vein. The superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus are going to feed into what is called right here, the right transverse sinus. Also feeding into the right transverse sinus, we have right here, the cavernous sinus, which feeds into these two vessels here, which are called petrosal sinuses. So the cavernous sinus feeds into the petrosal sinus. The right transverse sinus are all feeding into what's called the sigmoid. This term sigmoid means S-shaped sinus. We will see also down in this region the occipital sinus, which we can see clearly feeding into the right vertebral vein. Now, taking a look at this diagram here of the brain, we can see these same vessels, but maybe in a little bit more clear fashion. So right here, we have the superior sagittal sinus. That would make this right here the inferior sagittal sinus, which would make this right here the great cerebral vein. These are both feeding into that straight sinus. Right here would be the transverse sinus. Right here would be the occipital sinus. So here is the vertebral vein. Right here is the S-shaped sigmoid sinus. Right here is the cavernous sinus. These vessels here and here would be the petrosal, named as in the petrous part of the temporal bone, petrosal sinus. And we can see then the petrosal sinus and the sigmoid sinus are emptying into the internal jugular. Taking a look here at this posterior view, we can see the superior sagittal sinus, which has been cut. We can see right here the cavernous sinus. We can see in these vessels here the petrosal sinus, as well as right there, petrosal sinus, and here too. We can see this is the transverse sinus. And here we're getting our S-shaped sigmoid sinus. And then cut on both sides, we have our internal jugular. All right, and that is it for the veins of the head and the neck. So we've actually now named those veins that we need to name. Please stay tuned for the next video looking at fetal circulation. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.